Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of this podcast talking about music. There's a musical artist that is really interesting to me. I didn't discover him until the sort of comeback that happened in the late 70s, early 80s, around the was considered to be a comeback for this guy. But he sort of had his original heyday, I guess, in the 60s, in the sort of Frank Zappa world. And you may know of this person, Captain Beefheart, Don Van Vliet. He's one of those sort of musical enigmas. It's like he was in that realm with Frank Zappa, with that kind of free form, crazy stream of consciousness, unusual instrumentation, unusual musical forms. Zappa was actually a little more mainstream than Captain Beefheart in some ways. Zappa did songs and music that had lyrics and all that kind of stuff. I mean, lyrics that were song lyrics. Beefheart kind of, if you weigh, he was more towards poetry, and in the early days, a kind of spoken word poetry feel to some of his work. The album that a lot of people talk about the most with him, I believe, is this one, Trout Mask Replica, which was with the Magic Band, Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band, with some of the classic assumed names in rock and roll history. But this is a massive double album of poetry set to music that is annoying to some people. I'll put it that way. It doesn't sound like regular music. It certainly doesn't sound like the other music that was coming out at the same time, although there was a lot of experimentation going on at the time, and experimentation, you had things like Revolution Number 9 on the Beatles' White Album, which was pretty radical. This is in some ways related to that, although maybe a little bit less avant-garde. But Captain Beefheart had this kind of swampy, gritty, grungy vibe to his voice and his presence, and the lyrics to his songs tended to be these kind of like sort of seedy storytelling, character, like strange characters, that kind of swampy vibe to it. But on this album, the time signatures, the timing, the attention to rhythm is in some ways kind of hard to grasp, because it doesn't, a lot of times the musicians seem to be playing in 3 or 4 different tempos over a drum beat that doesn't seem to ever really find itself. It's the kind of thing that you sort of have to get used to, and then the words on top of that are sort of the stream of consciousness, almost like beat poetry kind of thing. Not quite at the Herman Munster level, but the type of thing where it was that crazy fever dream kind of imagery that you get from some of his songs. But then there's some songs on here, there's some songs that I listen to. I actually like this album quite a bit. I put it on sometimes and just listen. You put it on and listen to it. It's not something that you want to have on and maybe in the background at your swanky cocktail party. But it's a fun album. But I will tell you something. There are other Captain Beefheart albums that I like and listen to more often, and there's 3 of them that I'm going to focus on, and they are the ones I was talking about that came out in a sort of a resurgence for him, where he went down some different paths, some more slightly sort of mainstreamish rock and roll, still with a kind of swampy boogie kind of thing, and then in the late 70s and early 80s until his death, he was putting out albums that had a feel to them that I think was reminiscent of some other things that might have been happening around that time and are kind of related in interesting ways with groups like the Residents or Snakefinger or some real experimental forms taking a sort of pop music idea or the rock music idea of songs that have lyrics over a beat with guitars, drums, bass, and maybe a trombone or something. But he put out these albums that I think are pretty classic. I really like all three of these. This one is called Shiny Beast, and it's got some really great songs on here. There's one is called Suction Prince that I think is pretty great. It's got a driving rhythm. The thing that's different about these three albums I'm talking about from his Trout Mask replica is that they have a more cohesive sound to them as far as the rhythms and the beats, the timing, and the musicianship on Trout Mask replica. His Magic Band, his original Magic Band, they are actually better musicians than is apparent on a first listen. If you give it a listen, it might sound a bit like, the Shags or something, where it's like, all right, these are people who never heard music, who picked up instruments and tried to figure out what you do with a guitar. But no, these guys are quite good. Once you get into it, once you listen to it a few times, you start to go, oh, okay, that's complicated. If you're a musician, you can kind of tell, you're like, I don't know if I could do that without a lot of practice. But this had some musicians on here who were very, very well trained in their instruments and their music, and under the banner of Captain Beefheart, he, according to legend, was very meticulous about the parts that he wanted everyone to play. In other words, there's no, I assume that there's not a whole lot of improvisation or personal improvisation. You get the impression that Captain Beefheart told everybody what to play, and they played it like that. And it's interesting because it does have a sound. These three albums that I'm talking about have a certain sound to them that implies that. I mean, it really has a Captain Beefheart vibe to it. But like I said, this has got a more solid rhythm. You can listen to these songs. They're more song-like. The lyrics are still pretty swampy, and there's still that kind of grungy edge to the music that's it's kind of like this driving, almost like boogie rock, I guess is the word that they use. But and then you got his his wailing voice on top of it. He's kind of like, he is desperate to tell you these stories, like with his last breath he's screaming out these stories of strange people and situations. Shiny Beast is a really good album. I would say this is a good place to start if you haven't really gotten into Captain Beefheart. And some people think that he is kind of like the James Joyce of rock music in some ways, where he writes these things that people claim to like, but they don't really like, but they claim they like it because other people like it, that kind of thing. Like, oh yeah, I really like Ulysses. I've read it 4 times. It's really good. But no, I mean, it is a little bit off-putting at first when you put on Trout Mask replica. It's the kind of thing you put on and you're like, what am I hearing? But then after a while, you're like, okay, this is funny. I like it. It's something about it. I want to hear it again. It's like smoking cigarettes. The first time you ever smoked a cigarette, you were like, ah, but then you were like, I want another one. And then you were addicted. Maybe that's not a great comparison. But Captain Beefheart is something, acquired taste is another term that they use. But this one, a little bit easier to get into, still a little bit edgy. Another one is Doc at the Radar Station. And this one has got some great songs on it. Hothead and Dirty Blue Jean. Their songs they're great songs. And they're driving. A lot of times there's like this driving, rolling rhythm to his music. Again, you have some really great musicians on here that he was, some of these guys were with him for a couple of albums, the previous, and the You got some people in here who played with other bands like Snakefinger, who I mentioned earlier, I think, in The Residents, you know. So you've got some accomplished musicians in here. That's Captain himself. This is the drummer, Robert Williams, who is a really interesting drummer, a very polyrhythmic, very precise drummer, kind of almost progressive style. And he's done albums with a lot of other interesting people. One thing I'm going to talk about in another episode is an album he did with Hugh Cornwell of the Stranglers, which I think is one of the most interesting albums of that era. But Dock at the Radar Station, great album. And the other one here is Ice Cream for Crow. This one is yet another great album with great songs. Ice Cream for Crow is a great song. And this, I believe, was his final album. But it's these three albums that I'm talking about. If you've only heard Trout Mask Replica or heard snips of it, and you kind of made your decision, you were like, "Nah, I don't really like Captain Beefheart." You know, I heard Trout Mask Replica and not into it. I would say if you're willing to take another dip, I would try these three that I mentioned. These three Captain Beefheart albums. They are later period albums, of course, and but they're quite good. They're solid, and the songs are something. They're like with Trout Mask Replica, it would be really hard for a band to practice those and play covers of them. But you could very conceivably take the songs on those three albums and do covers of them, you know, other bands, and they have. In fact, someone has done covers of a few of them. Someone actually has done a cover of the entire Trout Mask Replica album. So I guess I stand corrected on that. But there's a lot to find in Captain Beefheart's music. A lot of interesting technical stuff. A lot of precision playing. Which doesn't seem like it would lend itself very well to the style that swampy, you know, boot stomp kind of music that you would associate him with that gnarly voice of his, that kind of grizzled, you know, old guy who lives out in the desert in a trailer, you know, shouting from, you know, and reciting his wild poetry. There is an interesting, you know, juxtaposition between that looseness and that gravelly voice of his and the precision of the playing and the almost progressive rock style of the playing, which is, I think, really interesting. And I definitely recommend getting into those three later albums of Captain Beefheart and then, you know, and then go back in the catalog, because there's some very interesting places that I don't like quite as much, but still worth listening to. And then there's some things that I do like. And then Trout Mask Replica is maybe third album, I think, is early in his career, but it's the one that's got that great fish head cover, you know, and it's really fun to listen to, I think. And people I know have, you know, we put that thing on every so often. My musician friends and we put it on, and we know the words, and we laugh. It's funny. I mean, he can be very funny. That's another thing. The lyrics are, in some cases, hilarious. They're portraits of situations that you imagine he probably experienced in his early days in the counterculture of the 60s. But anyway, that's my review of some Captain Beefheart albums, and I give him a thumbs up. And sadly, no longer with us. So yeah, go back into his catalog and check him out. And thanks for listening. And I'll talk to you again soon.